Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 11 of the JFK assassination, 60 years later. In episode 10, we examined the mystery of Robert Knudson. He was the White House photographer who had worked there in the White House since the time of the Truman administration and continually all the way up through the Richard Nixon administration. A very professional photographer, obviously of great renown, and whose integrity and veracity, as I indicated, was never questioned by anyone. I pointed out that Knudson had given an interview to a popular national photography magazine in 1977 where he stated that he had been the photographer for the autopsy. And of course, in his two obituaries in the Washington Post and New York Times, they also pointed out that he had been the photographer for the autopsy. Well, I think what I failed to mention, though, is that when he returned home on the weekend of the assassination, he had been away for 3 days, he told his family that he had photographed the autopsy. He emphasized that it was a horrific thing, very difficult for him emotionally. He couldn't tell his family what he had seen. He was sworn to secrecy, just like everybody else in the autopsy. It was considered a classified operation under military rubric and military principles of classifying things. But he did tell them that he had photographed the autopsy. And there's no reasonable doubt that Knudson absolutely believed this, and that he had been made to believe that whatever he was photographing was the autopsy. But we also know that he was not at the official autopsy. That was John Stringer, the official photographer for the autopsy, professional. He specialized in autopsy photographs. He taught medical photography there at the Bethesda Medical School. Knudson was a social photographer, not a medical photographer. But clearly, Knudson's being told, what you're photographing here is the autopsy. We still don't know to this day, what was going on here. But there's something else I want to emphasize about Knudson's story. And that is that you'll recall that when I talked about that big black hearse vehicle that brought the president's body in the shipping casket to the morgue, where that Navy team sneaked it into the morgue at 6:35 p.m., I emphasized how this could not have just happened on its own. Now, just as a refresher, recall that the official narrative is that the body was brought into the morgue for the first and only time at 8 p.m. That's to conduct the autopsy. And that the autopsy starts at 8:15 p.m. That's the official narrative, that it was brought in by a Navy honor guard consisting of members of all the armed forces, all dressed up in their official uniforms. But as Sergeant Boyden told the ARRB, the body was brought in an earlier time, I should say sneaked in an earlier time at 6:35 p.m., and he had his after-action report, and this was corroborated the testimony and the statements of the Navy enlisted men who had actually carried in the shipping casket containing the president's body. We had Galler's Funeral Home, their memorandum stating the president's body was brought in a shipping casket. And then we had Colonel Fink's testimony, don't forget, in the Clay Shaw trial, where he said that he got this telephone call from Commander Humes, one of the other three pathologists, at 8 p.m., inviting him to come over and participate in the autopsy, and that Commander Humes told him in that conversation that they already had x-rays of the president's head, what we called an admission against interest. And the only way that they could already have x-rays of the president's head was if the body was in there before 8 p.m. So Fink's testimony establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that the body was in fact sneaked in early into the Bethesda morgue. But my point was that, for this to happen, for the shipping casket to come over in this morgue, and remember that the people in this hearse are men in suits. We still don't know who those men were. Were they CIA? Were they Secret Service, FBI? We just don't know. The military, the CIA, the Secret Service, whoever knew who those individuals were, have succeeded in keeping silent about this aspect of the autopsy for 60 years. But there's no question about the fact that there was some force orchestrating this, planning it, because that hearse just doesn't pop up out of nowhere. Those people don't just, those men in suits don't just decide, hey, let's go do this. It's obvious that somebody, some sinister deep state force is orchestrating this thing, moving the pieces like on a chessboard, telling people where they need to go. Ordinarily in an autopsy, it's the autopsy physicians who are in charge. It's a pretty straightforward thing. You bring the body into the pathologists and they perform the autopsy, and they're in charge of performing the autopsy. Well, the thing about Knudson is that, again, it's clear that there's this overarching entity, group of people, person, whatever, that's orchestrating this thing, that is directing this overall autopsy, because Knudson's being directed. You go over to Andrews Air Force Base, and then he's being directed to something that he's being told is the autopsy, and to take photographs there. And he's made to be convinced that what he photographed was the autopsy. That doesn't just happen out of nowhere. Knudson doesn't self-direct himself to go. Somebody's saying, you need to go to this room, you need to go to this room, you need to take these photographs, and oh, by the way, this is the autopsy you're photographing. So I wanted to emphasize that again, this deep state force that's planning this thing, orchestrating this thing, in an overall context, is here present with respect to Knudson. And we're going to see evidence of this deep state, secretive, sinister, really evil force later on in this episode as well. Now, let's shift gears here, and let's examine what it is that they were trying to accomplish. What was their aim of sneaking the body in almost an hour and a half before the official entry time into the morgue? Because clearly they've got an objective here. You don't sneak a body into a morgue an hour and a half later. You don't keep it secret. You don't hide it. You don't cover it up without something sinister going on here. I mean, that's just common sense. And so let's examine what their aim was in doing this. In ascertaining that aim, it's necessary for us to put the overall official narrative in context of what happened in this assassination. Now, that narrative, of course, is set forth in the Warren Commission report. That was the official body that Lyndon Johnson appointed to supposedly investigate this assassination. And their conclusions were that there were 3 shots fired, and all from the president's rear. You'll recall that the president was traveling in his limousine down Elm Street in a westerly direction, and that 3 shots supposedly rang out from the Texas School Book Depository, which was located to the president's rear. And the 3 shots supposedly emanated from the 6th floor, where they found 3 bullet casings. The first shot, according to the official narrative, hits Kennedy in the back of the neck, exits the front of the neck, enters the back of Governor Conley, breaks some ribs of the governor, and then exits his chest, and then hits his wrist and breaks his wrist bone, exits his wrist, and then hits his thigh and lodges in his thigh. This is the so-called magic bullet theory. And part of the magic here, the reason it's called the magic bullet theory or the pristine bullet theory, is that this bullet, after doing all this damage, breaking bones and so forth, comes out in pristine condition. Instead of mangled, which is what you would expect when it hits bone, it's going to get mashed. This is a bullet that looks like it's never been fired. And interestingly enough, there's also no flesh, no blood on it. It comes out in an effective condition in which it has really never been fired, or maybe fired in a big thing of water, or maybe cotton. So it truly is magical in this sense. But that's the theory. That's bullet 1. The second bullet misses the car entirely. I mean, this so-called expert marksman that is hitting a moving target with a Italian-made Manlico Carcano rifle with a misaligned scope. Well, he misses the car entirely. And the bullet hits the curb, and it ricochets and hits a bystander named James Teague. And Teague ends up with blood on his cheek, and so that's how they knew that a bullet had entirely missed out of the 3. The third bullet, according to the official scenario, hits the president in the back of the head at sort of the hairline, the back of the head at the bottom of the hairline, and then blows out and knocks out the top right side of the head. So that's the official scenario. Now, there's actually another official scenario. A lot of people don't realize that's the Warren Commission official scenario. And those are the 3 bullets. But there's another official scenario, and that's the FBI report. The FBI actually did its own investigation of this thing, separate and apart from the Warren Commission. And the FBI's version is slightly different. The FBI's version says that the president was hit with 2 shots. And that the third shot, it's still 3-shot scenario, the third shot hit Governor Conley. Now, Governor Conley, to the day he died, said that he was not hit by the same bullet that hit the president, which, of course, is the magic bullet theory. He said he was absolutely certain that there were 2 separate bullets. And Conley is from Texas, and he was a longtime hunter, and so was his wife. And his wife verified the same thing, Nellie Conley. She says it's 2 separate bullets. One hits the president, then another one is fired, and it hits the governor. So that's the FBI's version. Two shots hit Kennedy, just like the Warren Commission, and then a third shot hits Conley. But do you see the problem? The problem is that the FBI leaves out the bullet that hits James Teague. See, because if they include that in their report, that means 4 shots. 2 that hit Kennedy, 1 that hits Conley, and 1 that hits Teague, or the curb that ricochets and hits Teague. That's 4 shots. That means that it's 2 shooters. So how did the FBI handle this? They just airbrush Teague out of existence. They just act like he doesn't exist. They don't mention him. You see, that's the way they handle it. 3 shots, no problem, but we just will act like Teague didn't exist, that this just never happened at all. Well, the Warren Commission figured, well, we might not get away with that. So they decide that they need to deal with this Teague situation because that's clearly a separate bullet. But now they've only got 2 bullets left, though. So they can't do what the FBI said happened. They can't say, and what Conley said happened, they can't say 1 bullet hits Conley and the other bullet hits the president in the back, because then they've got the headshot wound. So that's a problem. Again, that's 4 shots. So that's how they come up with the magic bullet theory. Now let's examine the bullet that hits the back of President Kennedy's head under the Warren Commission official narrative. You'll recall Sandra Spencer's testimony. She was the Navy petty officer that worked closely with the White House in the development of photographs, and she testified that the autopsy photograph she developed showed a massive excised hole in the back of Kennedy's head. This like a orange, the size of an orange or a baseball. And this corroborated the testimony of the Dallas physicians, the nurses, Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent, the guy that from the ambulance, the funeral home that felt the head sticking out, the wound sticking out, the skull sticking out, the avulsed wound when he was putting the body into the casket, the journalist that saw it, all the evidence that established this hole, which established that this autopsy photograph of President Kennedy is fraudulent. And as I've indicated before, there's no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. Okay, why would they do this? Well, because they're obviously charged with the mission of this autopsy to hide the fact that there have been shots fired from the front. Now, why would that be important to them? Well, we're not going to delve into that right now, but that is really an essential part of this plot, of why they deemed it necessary to do this. And it's actually a part of, an ingenious part of this plot. But we're going to set that aside for now. For now, we're just going to focus on the fact that this was the mission of these pathologists. They were charged with doing this, that hiding the fact that shots had been fired from the front in this autopsy, and making it look like all the shots have come from the rear. All 3 shots have come from the rear. So clearly this photograph that shows the back of Kennedy's head to be intact is part of this mission. There's no big blowout wound there. It's only a head that's intact. Now there's a dark humor part of this thing, is that obviously there has to be an entry wound in the back of the president's head in order to be consistent with the official scenario. The idea is that the bullet enters the president's head down at the base of the skull and in the back, and then blows out the top right of his head. Well, they always maintained that this bullet hole, as I say, was at the bottom of the hairline at the back of the head. Well, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the investigation of the Kennedy assassination in the 1970s, you'll recall this was in response to the outrage from seeing the Zapruder film on national television. They had a medical panel examine all the medical evidence and so forth. And after examining all the evidence, this medical panel of pathologists determines that it just doesn't work where they have the entry wound, and consistent with their theory that the bullet exits the top right of the head and blows out the top right of the head. And they figured out that the only way that will work is if they move the entry wound 4 inches up on the head. So they tell the pathologist, y'all got it wrong here. We need to move the entry wound to the bullet 4 inches higher to make this thing work. And so the pathologists don't get it. And they said, no. Hume says, we were there. The hole was really there at the base. And they said, no, you don't understand. It has to be 4 inches higher. It just brings to mind, oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And so finally Hume buckles and says, oh, he finally, I think, sees the light here. And so he says, oh, okay, yeah, we were there, but yeah, you're right. The bullet hole is really 4 inches higher, the entry wound. So a little dark humor part of this whole thing. But in any event, that's how they handled the mission that they obviously had with respect to the head wound. Just create this false photograph showing the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact. Now, there's another thing I want to emphasize with respect to this, and is further corroborative evidence of what Saunders Spencer was saying and all the Dallas physicians and some of the people there at Bethesda as well, that there was this massive exit wound in the back of President Kennedy's head. The next day after the assassination was over, had been committed, a medical student in Dallas named Billy Harper was there in Dealey Plaza, and he discovered a bone fragment, a sizable bone fragment, that came to be known as the Harper fragment. And lo and behold, his uncle was a pathologist at Methodist Hospital in Dallas. So he delivers this fragment that became known as the Harper fragment to his uncle, who brings together a team of pathologists there at Methodist Hospital to examine this bone. And after doing an extensive examination, careful examination, their official conclusion is that this is occipital bone. Now, why is that important? Well, as I indicated in an earlier episode, the occipital region of the skull is the back of the skull. And so if this is occipital bone, which this team of pathologists determined it was, that would corroborate that this exit wound, massive exit wound, actually was there, because the occipital bone would have been part of this hole that was blasted out when the bullet hit Kennedy in the upper right forehead. So they reached that conclusion, and they shipped the Harper fragment to Bethesda National Medical Center. And lo and behold, it's later determined that the doctors in Dallas, the pathologists there at Methodist, were wrong, that it was really parietal bone, but conveniently lose the Harper fragment. So nobody could ever examine it again. Now let's go over to the neck wound. Again, the magic bullet theory. The bullet comes in the back of the neck, comes out the throat. Soon after President Kennedy was declared dead, two of the treating physicians there at Parkland had a press conference. And these two physicians were Malcolm Perry and Kemp Clark, both of whom were treating physicians and very renowned surgeons. Now, keep in mind what I said earlier. Parkland Hospital was and is one of the best treatment hospitals in the country for gunshot wounds. That's what they specialize in, trauma. And it's a teaching hospital. They're training physicians there on treating gunshot wounds and knife wounds and so forth. So, I mean, President Kennedy couldn't have found a better place to be treated as far as gunshot wounds are concerned. And Dr. Kemp Clark, he was director of neurological surgery at Parkland, which, like I indicated, is a teaching hospital. And then Malcolm Perry, he had a distinguished career. He was a treating surgeon there. He went on to become professor emeritus at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center until the time he died. And Southwestern Medical Center is a renowned medical institution there in Texas, in Dallas. And when at the time of the assassination, Perry told the Warren Commission that he had already treated hundreds of gunshot wounds. Okay, so I mean, gives you a pretty good idea of what Parkland is specializing in. Hundreds of gunshot wounds. So during this press conference, Perry emphasizes 3 different times that this wound right here is an entrance wound. And the reason he determines that, based on his long experience of having treated hundreds of gunshot wounds, is that it was just a little tiny circle the size of a bullet. And so that indicates an entry wound. The bullet enters the body with the size of the bullet and then is pushing mass in front of it, as I indicated in an earlier segment, and then blows out in a blowout. So Perry was telling the press at this press conference, this is an entrance wound. And he emphasized that 3 times. Now, that entrance wound, they performed a tracheotomy there at Dallas, as I indicated in an earlier episode. And what they do with a tracheotomy is they take a scalpel and they do a very thin line across the person's neck, and then they insert the breathing tube. And they did this thin line over this bullet hole. So they do the thin line, and they open it up, and they put the breathing tube in. Well, according to Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who was another treating physician there, and he wrote a great book on what happened there in Trauma Room 1, he said that once the breathing tube is removed, the wound, the scalpel wound closes in on itself, leaving the bullet hole back in its original condition. And that's what he said happened. Well, when we get over to Bethesda in this hour and a half before the autopsy, they clearly are faced with a problem of what do they do with this bullet wound? Because if they're charged with making it look like all the bullets have come from the rear, they got to do something about this bullet wound. And one possibility is just ignore it, just act like it wasn't there. It's sort of like the Teague treatment that the FBI did, said, we just won't mention it, you know. So that's clearly one possibility of, hey, let's just not mention it. Dr. Humes, one of the 3 pathologists, he maintained under oath that he didn't even know that this was a wound until he talked to Dr. Perry on Saturday morning, the morning after the autopsy, when the body had already been embalmed and sent over to the Capitol and or to the White House. And so that was his story, that he didn't know this. Now, why wouldn't he know this? Well, if you look at the autopsy photographs, the front of the wound here is a horrible gash. It's just got this huge opening. And so, in other words, not the thin little line that Crenshaw said is done with the scalpel. It's just a horrible gash. So what obviously they've done is they ripped this thing open during that hour and a half. Now, why would they do that? Well, to make it look like an exit wound. Because remember, the exit wound blows out. And so you open this thing up in a horrible gash, and it looks like, oh, well, that's an exit wound. But then Humes is over here saying, well, I didn't even know that there was a wound there. I thought that was the tracheotomy. And so I didn't know that there was a wound here in the neck until I talked to Dr. Perry on Saturday morning. But that was clearly a lie. Now, how do we know it was a lie? Well, you'll recall that Colonel Fink, one of the other three pathologists, he testified in the Clay Shaw trial. Remember, in 1969, I believe. It was 6 years after the assassination in New Orleans. That was the trial where the prosecutor, Jim Garrison, was rejecting the official scenario of the assassination, that a lone nut communist former Marine had assassinated the president, and he was alleging that this was actually a highly sophisticated regime change operation, similar to the other regime change operations that the national security establishment had carried out against foreign leaders, and once again based on national security. And Fink testified in that trial. Remember that. We discussed that in a previous episode. Well, during that testimony, you'll recall that Fink's testimony was that he got this telephone call from Humes at 8 p.m. inviting him over, saying we already had x-rays of the skull. Well, later in his testimony, or either earlier in his testimony, I'm not sure the order, but he testified that the prosecutor asks him, why didn't you dissect the neck wound? And now, let's go back a minute and what he means by dissect. Recall when we were talking about the two brain exams, that they're in a brain exam, they section the brain. Okay, they cut it like a loaf of bread to determine bullet trajectories and find bullet fragments and so forth. Well, this is what they do also on a neck wound. They would section it or dissect it, as the prosecutor called it, in order to do the same thing. So he asked Fink, why didn't you dissect the neck wound? And Fink gives this long-winded answer. He just talks and talks and talks and talks. He's filibustering. And he's thinking that he's going to, bamboozle the prosecutor. But this was one sharp prosecutor. Prosecutor wasn't going to let him get away with that. And the prosecutor's listening very carefully to his answer. And then when he finishes answering this long answer, the prosecutor, I'm paraphrasing, but the prosecutor says, well, thank you, Dr. Fink. Now, would you tell me why y'all didn't dissect the neck wound? So Fink is clearly uncomfortable at this point because his little strategy didn't work, his filibuster strategy, but he tries it again. And he just gives this long-winded answer and so forth. And the prosecutor says, well, okay, but why didn't you dissect the neck wound? So the prosecutor's got him on the hook, and he's not going to let him go. And Fink clearly has to be squirming at this point. But finally, the prosecutor just turns to the judge. Remember, this is a trial where the judge is in charge. And the prosecutor says, Your Honor, he is not answering the question. So it's clear that Fink did not want to answer this question. But the judge is in charge. And so the judge turns to Colonel Fink, because this isn't a military tribunal. This is a civilian courtroom. And this guy's got to comply with the judge's orders. And he orders Fink, answer the question. Well, now Fink's done. And now it comes out. Fink says, because I was ordered not to. Okay, so Fink is establishing that they were fully aware of this neck wound on the evening of the assassination, which is exposing Humes' testimony that they weren't aware of it until the following morning as a perjurious lie. Okay, so here he's saying, I was ordered not to. Okay, now remember we talked about this deep state force? Somebody is in this autopsy directing things. The autopsy pathologists are the ones in charge. They're the ones that make these determinations. And here somebody is saying, stay away from it. Okay, that's that deep state force again, orchestrating, moving the pawns on the chessboard here, the pieces on the chessboard. So the prosecutor says, who was that? And Fink says, I don't remember. Now, what are the chances that he's not going to remember? I mean, this is a guy that's saying, don't do what you're supposed to do as an autopsy pathologist. And on the President of the United States, how could he forget? Well, my hunch is that he was scared. He's an Army colonel, and he did not want to reveal who this was. Now, I should also point out that there were people inside this autopsy room that stated that there were very sinister men in suits in this autopsy room. We don't really know who they were, but it's part of this appearance of this deep state force that's orchestrating things here. So that's in any event, that's how they deal with the neck wound. They're clearly trying to figure out how to avoid the problem of showing that these are all shots fired from the rear. So we still have to examine why they would do this. What's the purpose? We can see that this was their purpose of sneaking the body in early, making it look like there's no shots fired from the front, making sure that all the shots are fired from the rear, but why? And that's what we'll examine in a later episode. The overarching plot here, which was an extremely ingenious plot, and why this particular mission of hiding shots fired from the front was part of that ingenious plot. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 11 of the JFK assassination 60 years later.